Fragments a lot more than most people are able to accomplish in an entire lifetime. You have already accomplished in your young life. Why in the world? Why in the world are you running for president and possibly becoming a politician and moving to Washington, D.C.?
It does seem at times like a sharp poke in the eye. At least that's what it would feel like the job would be. But I'm doing it by way of a sacrifice to give back to this country that has allowed me to live the American dream that I have. I want to pass that to the next generation. As the father of two sons, I do worry that their generation will not be able to live that same dream that I did. And I do think that young people in particular, Allie, I think it's true of all of us, but I think it's especially true of young people. We're so lost. We are so hungry for purpose and meaning right now. And I see a conservative movement that has such an opportunity to fill that gap, but yet is not today. The left fills that vacuum. Race, gender, sexuality, climate. I am longing for us to fill that vacuum with something more meaningful. What it means to be an American, reviving the individual, family, nation, God, the things that I grew up with. I want to pass that on, especially to the next generation of young Americans. And truthfully, to be just really straight and honest about it, I didn't see another candidate in this race coming anywhere near close to an ability to actually do that on a time scale that matters. And so that's why I'm in the race.
Yeah. I want to talk about your worldview. You mentioned a lot of things, obviously, that we care a lot about and talk a lot about on this show. This is a Christian show, obviously, in the Republican Party, conservative movement. You've got a lot of Christians, and there is, Christianity in the fabric of our nation that really founded the ideals upon which we're established. You are not a Christian, and yet you share a lot of the same principles that we do. Like, where does that come from? When you go back to, why do I believe what I believe about what this country is supposed to look like, where rights come from, where right and wrong comes from, where do you get that?
Where equality comes from, for that matter. It didn't start in some piece of paper. It starts because we're equal in the eyes of God. We're equal in the eyes of each other because of that. So it's interesting. I did go to Catholic high school. That was my first exposure and what ended up being a deep study of the Bible. But it actually started much earlier than that. That's the probably technical answer. The real answer is the family I was raised in raised me in a tradition that, it so happens, shares those same values, including overlapping with the same Christian values that this nation is founded on. Duty, sacrifice, truth, being grounded in the love of the family, a belief that we are equal. The way my parents taught me growing up in our tradition was we're all equal because God resides in each of us. I think in the Judeo-Christian founding of this nation, we say the same thing. We're equal in the eyes of each other because we're equal in the eyes of God, that we have duties, that God put us here for a purpose, for a reason, and we are here to realize that purpose, that there is a single truth. And so for me, when I would say in Catholic school, read the Bible for the first time, it didn't feel like I was reading it for the first time. And I'm not running to be a pastor. I would not be qualified to be a pastor of a church. But in terms of leading this country as commander-in-chief, as the next president, I do share those values so deeply that I'm also in a position as a young person, as a millennial, as a first-generation American, and yes, as somebody who's Hindu, not Christian, to stand staunchly for religious liberty in this country, to stand staunchly and unapologetically for the values that this country was founded on. And the truth is, nobody's going to accuse me of being a Christian nationalist or a white nationalist as I do it. In many ways, I am at liberty as a member of a generation, of first millennial ever to run for president as a Republican, to do things with greater latitude and conviction than maybe even other politicians who are afraid of the political consequences may not be able to take on in the same way that I am. And so with that comes, yes, an opportunity, but also a sense of responsibility. And I take that responsibility pretty seriously.
The thing that I think that you're strongest on is being anti-ESG and the wokeification that we've seen in corporations. This is obviously something that you've spoken about and written about a lot. It brings me great comfort to know that someone is running for president who truly gets it. You're not just reiterating a lot of the talking points that you hear podcasters, commentators, radio hosts say. You seem to really understand where this stuff comes from and why it's dangerous. I'm curious, and I know that you've articulated these things before, but just for my audience, since most of us already know where you stand on that stuff and we're with you 100%, on these issues that my audience talks about a lot, abortion. Tell us where you stand on that, not just as an issue, but also as far as legislation goes.
Sure. So I am unapologetically pro-life. I believe that life begins at conception and that unborn life is life. This is important to me. I am personally supporting efforts here in Ohio on issue number 1, reaching the ballot soon. I went to Iowa recently on the special day that they signed the 6-week legislation. That day, it was important to me. I flew there to be there to celebrate that occasion. I think Roe was wrongly decided. One of the most important things that Trump gave us was a Supreme Court that in turn delivered Dobbs, overturning Roe. I also believe that this issue actually, if we want to get to truth, more Americans, way more Americans, are pro-life today than will actually admit it. Clarence Thomas proved that through a brilliant question he asked. It was based on a real case. Pregnant woman walking down the street. She's assaulted. Unborn child dies as a result. I have yet to meet a single American who says that that criminal does not deserve liability for that death. So that says we all share the same pro-life instincts. Nearly all of us do. We've just turned it into this artificial men's versus women's rights issue when in fact it is a human rights issue. So as a matter of policy, I think that we will do better in our movement, in the pro-life movement, if we're talking more about adoption, talking more about childcare, talking more about sexual responsibility for men, including with legal teeth attached to that in an era of genetic and paternity tests. And when we talk about it that way, I've discovered that this issue doesn't have to be as divisive as we made it out to be. To the contrary, we can actually stand for life, but do it in a way that gives other people permission to actually agree with us. In their hearts, they probably do, but they've worn this exterior, making this women's versus men's issue. So at a high level, that's where I'm at on it, and I'm happy to go in whatever direction you'd like.
Yeah, as far as federal legislation goes, there's been a few proposals of that. Of course, I think ultimately pro-lifers would love to simply recognize that those preborn children should have equal protection in the eyes of the Constitution. We believe that they already do, but that the law should be interpreted as such. What are your thoughts on federal legislation that would restrict abortion, ban abortion, depending on what's able to be passed?
Well, let's first talk about the federal legislation that is on the table right now, or they're trying to put on the table, which is Joe Biden's efforts to codify Roe versus Wade as the standard into federal law, which I think would be a disaster. I'm a strict constitutionalist. I'm an originalist when it comes to the Constitution. That is why I was a staunch, since law school onward, staunch constitutional opponent of Roe versus Wade on principled grounds. I think that on principled grounds, and on the grounds both of the Constitution, as well as looking at what over the next 30 years is going to prevent the loss of as many unborn children as possible, I actually think this is best driven by the states. The moment that we federalize this issue, the same shoe will fit the other foot. And I think we need to think this through. I know this is a little bit of a minority perspective in the pro-life movement, though other senators and congressmen who are some of the staunchest pro-life advocates agree with me and have shaped my thinking on this. Here's the reality. There's something called preemption. Preemption, it's a supremacy clause in the Constitution that says that federal laws preempt state laws. Right now, we've adopted correctly on the back of Dobbs the position that the federal government should have nothing to do with this. This is an issue for the states, and if a state wants to ban abortion, absolutely it can, it should, and many are already taking bold and proper steps in that direction. Here's the problem, though. Once we federalize that issue, the moment the Democrats then pass a piece of legislation that preempts all of those state laws, more babies will die over the next 30 years, I believe. More unborn children will die over the next 30 years. If we cross the Rubicon of turning this into an issue that opens itself up to federal preemption of the great laws that are hopefully spreading across this country from Iowa to Ohio. So I think it's really important to think for the long run here. we have the same objective, but I think that's really important that we pause
Hmm.
to think about the tactics before we do something we regret.
That's an interesting perspective. I would love to see that debated because, as you said, there are good pro-life people on both sides of that argument, but well articulated. Okay, let's end with talking about gender ideology. I've seen many of your
Yes.
comments on that. Obviously, similar to abortion, I think that the majority of people probably agree that a 10-year-old boy shouldn't be chemically castrated, but it's become this very divisive and political and partisan issue. And so what do you think about the legislation happening in places like Texas and other red states that says, sorry, it's not going to be legal to put kids through puberty blockers and double mastectomies and things like that? Do you think that that's moving in the right direction?
I do. And I think it's the compassionate direction to move as well. When a kid is saying that their gender doesn't match their biological sex, they're going through a mental health struggle. That's a mental health condition. And the compassionate thing to do is not to affirm that confusion. That's not compassion. That is cruelty. The compassionate thing to do is actually to figure out what's going wrong in that kid's life. And the fact that that's now beyond the pale to even explore shows how far we've come as a culture. So for the same reasons that we don't let kids in any 50 state, any one of the 50 states, to get a tattoo before the age of 18, to make a permanent life-altering change to their body that they may later regret, we should not allow those children to make life-altering genital mutilation or chemical castration-based changes to their bodies either. I did meet, she testified, I think, yesterday or the day before, Chloe in person, and Katie, her friend, as well, two young women who have been bold enough to share their stories of how they went through double mastectomies, in Katie's case, a hysterectomy, both of them through chemical intervention, through puberty blockers, that now regret those decisions. Those young women will never be the same again. It is sad that Katie will never bring a child into this world, that Chloe, who, despite wanting to, will never be able to breastfeed her children. It is inhumane. It is barbaric that we live in a culture that let that happen to children. And I think if we don't learn from those mistakes, we only have ourselves to be ashamed of. As U.S. president, I absolutely stand by the truth that there are two sexes. There are men and there are women, XX and XY. That's biological truth. We have to stand for the truth. If you're an adult, you want to dress how you want, I'm not going to stop you. But you're not going to change our language. You're not going to change the way we compete in sports. You're not going to change the way that we sort locker rooms. And you're certainly not going to change the way we indoctrinate our children. That's where I stand on it.
Thanks so much, Vivek. Totally agree with you. Yes and amen. Okay, how can people support you, learn more about you? There are a ton of issues, obviously, that we didn't get to today that people are curious about. How can they learn more about that?
Sure. So go to Vivek2024.com, Vivek 2024.com. And I think the thing I would say is that there's a choice in this Republican primary amongst good people. I think the other people running are good people. You will not hear me personally attacking others. Drawing policy contrasts, sure, but personal attacks, no. But the real choice I think we face in our movement right now is, do you want reform, incremental reform, or do you want revolution? And I stand unapologetically on the side of revolution, the American Revolution, speaking that truth without apology. And for those who favor incremental reform, I respect that. I'm not the right person for you. But for those who actually favor reform, not just reform, but revolution in the moment we live in, that's what I'm looking to lead. Is like the Reagan Revolution in 1980. I think we have a Ramaswamy revolution of sorts that we're planning for 2024. And I hope people can learn more. And if you're inclined, volunteer for us, donate, join the movement. That'll help us get there.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Thank you.